thought we would have the hand mic up here. Am I projecting okay? Are we okay in the back? I'll stay loud and do our best to stay on time. You turn it over to academics and you get into trouble with that issue of time, right? So, well, let me get us kind of settled a bit. First off, just say how much of an honor it is to be with you this morning, and I've just been pleased. I've sat and watched as the room is filled, and to me, each one of you being here, your presence in the room speaks that everything that our beginning panel has said, and the significance of strengthening families, and what that means in an event like this and what we're about today. See if I can get us going in the right direction. So we've already talked. Let me frame a little bit of what I want to talk about. My main hope today is to make you aware of some sources of information. So in some ways, if I can point you in the direction of some information, we'll have accomplished something of real value, I think. So as has been said, and as we're emphasizing here, our focus, and my focus, will be on this concept and idea of sustainable lifestyles, connecting in particular to this idea around how that gets sustained. And in many ways, my main hope is for us to open up our vision and view to the idea of sustainable lifestyles across generations as well. So I'm going to show you some areas where perhaps if we look with a smaller lens, we have some patterns that are deemed to be pretty positive and helpful. But if we look at them in the more extended pattern, they start to have a bit of a latent effect or delayed effect that gives us some concern about the sustainability over time. In many ways, the main point that I hope to reinforce today is that the sustainable prosperity of nations and of women and their children depends on the health of marriage and families, and the ways that we've talked about in that context and it being that fundamental unit of society. In particular, I want to make you aware of two sources that I'll be pulling a lot of information from. So if you have these sources, you have this information, you'll be able to go back and see a lot of the specifics. I'm going to try to go back and forth a little bit from international data. We're going to look at some international trends and patterns, but then I'm also going to show you some data that we see here in the United States that serves as a case example of some things that I'm highlighting. So first off, I'm going to be drawing from this report entitled The Sustainable Demographic Dividend. You can access the entire report at sustaineddemographicdividend.org. And this is where you'll see most of the international data and pattern coming that I'll be highlighting. And then I'll also be emphasizing some findings from a report that I did a couple of years ago entitled The Not Yet Report, looking at patterns of delayed marriage specifically here in the United States. So I'll point out where we go back and forth, but in many ways, like I said, if you have these two slides, if you have these two websites, I've accomplished much of what I was hoping to do, is make sure that you have these good sources of information. Now to frame us a little bit, let's talk a bit, and I don't think any of this will be too much news to anybody, so I'm going to move through this fairly quickly, is around understanding patterns of delayed marriage. We've noticed over the last generation that the average age of marriage around the world has been rising in every region for women and for men. And in our particular focus today, as we look at what we see for women, the mean age of marriage has increased in 100 of the 114 countries with the required data. And all of this is coming out of the United Nations population data and looking at those trends and those patterns. When you look at it in a specific country, like the United States, for example, these are the types of trend lines we see in nations around the world as we see this age of first marriage increasing. And now in many places, just like the United States, we're at historic all-time highs with these types of patterns. Now, generally when we see this and we understand this, the general understanding is that this is a positive trend. We see this and understand that this is positive because the general idea here is that as marriage is delayed, it creates more time for maturation, preparation, specifically in regards to economic and career readiness. Okay? So that's our general understanding around this. However, there's some emerging evidence that is starting to challenge this assumption. particularly when marriage is delayed after the age of 30, which is becoming the demographic norm in many parts of the world. Now, I'll be absolutely clear about something today as I'm talking about the term delayed marriage. There's a difference between what we could call first-order delay and what we would call second-order delay. I'm talking today about second-order delay. So first-order delay, which actually sets much of our first understanding, is this delaying of marriage that's moved from the teenage years, the adolescent years, into young adulthood. That's first-order delay, and we've understood for a long time its positive benefits. And I'll show you evidence that continues to show that it has some tremendous positive benefits. More of my focus today is on what we might call second-order delay, which is moving this from young adulthood further into the adulthood life course and the patterns that we see there. Now, why is this happening? Why we want to see some of this evidence and think a little bit about these trends and what they mean for families, what they mean for these patterns. Why are we not recognizing some of the issues here? I think there's 4 key misunderstandings that I hope to point out to you and help you recognize and appreciate. First off, delayed marriage is connected to the global trend of falling birth rates. And again, it's another pattern that on initial assessment we've seen as being a positive, helpful trend, but I'll show you as we start to look generationally, we start to get a very different idea and a very different notion. The next thing we see, so I won't talk a little bit, I don't have time and it won't be our focus today to talk too much about fertility patterns and sustainable economies. That could be an entire session and discussion of its own, but I'll point you to those resources and I'll point out some general patterns. Where I'd like to focus is more that delayed marriage isn't really the phenomenon that we have happening in many parts of the world. The trend is not towards just delayed marriage, but what would be better labeled as resequenced marriage. Resequenced marriage is creating a very different context than if we just saw it being delayed or pushed back. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. But this gets us into the patterns we see of non-marital childbirth and the global increase we see of single-headed households. And the outcomes for women and for children are particularly acute in those contexts and settings as they're bearing the brunt of those patterns and the inequalities of that. We also have a pattern that I note that many, particularly in the academic circles, are focusing only on the highly educated. And so we look at the trends of the highly educated and assume that that's what's happening. But when we look at the middle educated and the less educated segments of society, we see different trends and we see different patterns. So in some ways, the most vulnerable among us are the ones that we're least paying attention to and least addressing of their issues. And then finally, I'll share with you some of the new data that is actually showing us a change in our understanding of age of marriage and its relationship with marital quality, which has been understood, and many people view it as having a linear effect, that older is better. The new data is showing it's actually a curvilinear effect, that there's actually a balanced middle, and the errors are at the extremes when it comes to sustainability of marriage and family relationships. So I'll walk us through this a little bit, so we'll be careful with time. Okay. So first off, let's talk a little bit about, and like I said, this can't be much of our focus. The Sustained Demographic Dividend report that I pointed you to goes into much, much more detail than I'll be able to today. But what do we see in relation to delayed marriage and its connection to the falling birth rates that we see? This entirely impossible to fully interpret graph is tracking in some targeted countries the total fertility rate of children in these select countries, grouped a little bit by parts of the world. The main thing that we want to capture here is as we look at the data points across time, again coming from the United Nations population data, we see now in a very short period of time, within the last generation or two, a movement in many countries to where, as you see the red line demonstrating here, a decrease below the replacement rate of population. Now, here's the key to this, and this is what I mean by looking at generational sustainability. Economists for a long time have referred to this pattern as the demographic dividend. What happens in the first generation when this pattern happens is it actually contributes to economic prosperity. The resources are allocated, there's less children to invest in, and you see an immediate one-generation surge, if you will, in prosperity. But what happens is that demographic dividend has to be paid later. So what we now see in many countries around the world is a population pattern where many are moving into the later stages of life and that we don't see a rising generation coming behind. Chinese economists are calling this the 4-2-1 society, or the 4-2-1 economy. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, supported by 1 child. If you look at the patterns that we see in most of our welfare systems and our social security systems, they're all designed to be the opposite. They're designed for there to be a larger proportion contributing to a smaller, not the other way around. This, in many ways, will not be sustainable. And we start to see countries struggling in many ways around this and in different patterns. So, not our focus, but this is one, and of course, if our interest is in fostering sustainable economies, sustaining families and women, connection to that, they will be impacted by what will happen with these types of patterns more and more. So, we can talk more about that maybe in question and answers if needed, but that's a key pattern. The age of marriage is rarely being connected as much to these patterns that we see. And if we only look at them at the micro lens for maybe a single woman, or we look at them in a single generation, we may draw some very different conclusions than what we have to understand for true sustainability. Will be strengthening families, will be finding a balance. That's where the term, the sustainable demographic dividend, comes from. And where can we find that balance that will keep those needs met and make things manageable, but also look at the broader societal patterns that we have. Let's move a little bit to talk about direct economic consequences, because I think this is another area where some of our thinking gets set up in ways that might lead us to draw incorrect conclusions in the broader culture or society patterns. So let me show you some United States data here. This comes from our Not Yet report back in 2013. So we're looking at women's personal income levels in the United States broken into 3 groups. This first group over here is the less than high school educated. So this is our low education, low income group. This is our high school graduates, so they've completed high school and secondary education, some college, a community college sample, if you will. In the United States, we sometimes call that a middle America population. And then over here you have your college graduates, okay? So this first table is looking at women's personal income levels. And you notice something, and it's striking, and it's important, and it's worth noting. It's when we look at the pattern for college graduate women, there indeed seems to be a benefit, because each of these graphs are showing us age of marriage. So they're moving from a pattern, we're kind of cutting off here on the bottom, of less than 20 marriage, 20 to 23, 24 to 26, into the late 20s, 30 plus, and the never married. So we see this linear benefit. We do see when those educational opportunities occur and are happening, some delay of marriage seems to have a real benefit. But notice what happens when we look at the middle America and lower income segments of the population. We don't see anywhere near this same type of benefit. And we don't need to remind ourselves, at least in the United States population, this is only about 18 to 20% of the population. This is by far the majority of the population in a smaller group here. But we do see that, but then we see that trend. And so where we can and where it's possible, the educational component to it, that emphasis becomes critical, it becomes essential. But it also shows us that we may be promoting what could be seen as a college-educated model across the population, and we're not tending to the needs of populations where that may not be the strategies or patterns that can best help and encourage sustainable family economies. Now, interestingly enough, it is interesting to compare what we see with men. We actually see a curvilinear pattern with educated men. It's the men marrying in their early to mid-20s that actually end up having the highest levels of personal income But again, I want to mostly note the flatness that we have here in those other types of patterns. So for many, this is where we stop. And when we look at the economies of the age of marriage and its patterns, we tend to just look at these direct indicators. The main thing I hope to do today is to draw our attention to further the conversation, have more dialogue about also some of the indirect economic consequences. So even when we might see some of that direct benefiting cases, are we also paradoxically promoting some other indirect consequences that undermine what we're trying to do? So first off, let's look at family formation factors and what happens in patterns that we see with delayed marriage. This graph, again, comes from the United States, but it's a similar pattern that we've seen in other nations around the world. So again, it's worthy of our consideration. It's what my colleagues and I have termed the great crossover. It is perhaps the most significant demographic trend we've seen in the last generation, but it is one that is underreported, under-discussed, and under-dialogue. I think much of it, as our beginning panelists pointed out, it all comes of whether or not you're starting with a family lens, and whether the emphasis is about strengthening family. This is the example of what I meant, that we don't have so much a pattern of delayed marriage as we do a pattern of resequenced marriage. What you're looking at here on this graph line is the median age of marriage for women in the United States, drawn with the purple line. With the orange line, what you see is the median age of first birth. For a very long time, historically, we've noted a pattern where the median age of first marriage was lower than the median age of first birth. But sometime in the 1990s, what we saw was a crossover, a resequencing of these patterns, a change that is fundamentally altering family formation for many, many individuals and families, and ultimately for children. So as you see that pattern trend, we see that that crossover occurs and continues to move forward. What you see on the bottom blue bar graph is the number of children, the percent of children in the United States born in a non-marital childbirth, where the mother is not married at the time of the birth. And so we see that increasing and moving with that trend. Again, the link that is rarely emphasized, moving the United States towards a pattern that is close to half of its children being born in that family situation or context. Now again, it's instructive for us to look at this across social economic patterns to see some real differences emerge. So what you see here with this graph and pattern is the pattern that we see for college graduates. It's the same trend lines, same graph lines, but now just with the college graduate population. So you see with the circled line, that's the median age of marriage for college-educated women in the United States. What you see with the triangle line is the median age of first birth. What we see here, as we've always seen with the college-educated, is what we could call the success sequence of family formation. We see education, we see marriage, then we see family formation and childbirth. And you see with the bar graphs at the bottom, a very low level of non-marital childbirth patterns. When we look then just at the less than high school, the lowest educated segment of the population, the graph lines switch. The median age of birth has long been ahead of and come before the median age of marriage. And you can then see with the bar graph, the reason why that one gets tougher to see is because those bar graphs are pushing up now to by far the normative pattern of non-marital childbirth in those settings. But much of the story really comes from, in the United States, what we call that middle America group. 60% of the population that is graduating from high school has some college experience, but they're the group that crossed over. And as we see that crossing over, we see them following patterns more like their lower educated peers and counterparts rather than their higher educated. And with that being such a large portion of the population, that increase in non-marital childbirth patterns now continues to drive the overall crossover pattern that we see in the country. What happens when we look internationally? We see similar types of patterns, and we see in many parts of the world, but clearly some exceptions to that, we see a trend as well where we see the rise in non-marital childbirth patterns. So this becoming more and more normative, more and more common across these patterns as well. And you can spend some time in the Sustainable Demographic Dividend Report. They really break that down into much more countries than you see here, and really do a good job of highlighting the international data on those types of things. Connected to this is worth noting as well is that we also have seen a rise in single parenthood and single-headed households, given this connection of this as well. So we see this as a trend that's happening nationally and internationally as well. Again, we see areas where it's in much more increase and areas where it is much less, but we do see it as something that is not just isolated to one region or one area. We see it expanding quite a bit. Now, of course, the response at this point in time is, well, wait a minute. Isn't most of this just in cohabitation? These are children now that we're labeling as non-marital, but fundamentally they're in consensus unions, they're in cohabitation. Isn't that fundamentally the same? So these are marriage-like, and we really shouldn't have too much issue. There's no point in distinguishing between these. Accompanying the global megatrend of falling birth rates is a radical change in the circumstances in which many children are raised. And this comes from the report. As country after country has seen a surge of divorce and or out-of-wedlock births, and a sharp drop in the percentage of children living with both their married parents. And though many of these births are to cohabiting couples, families headed by cohabiting couples are significantly less stable than those headed by married couples. This means that children born outside of marriage are markedly more likely to be exposed to a revolving cast of caretakers, to spells of single parenthood, and increased risk of poverty compared to children born to married couples. I won't spend time with it now, but the report actually goes through and goes by country to country and demonstrates the research and studies that we have that show this more fragile sets of union and connection. And that ultimately we don't see these functioning the same, that children that are born in these contexts are at greater risk and have patterns around that are more challenging for them. So we can come back to that too more if there's some interest. We'll let the report cover that. I'm sure we're going to get psyched here on time if I'm not over. Let's talk for a minute though, because one of the more surprising things, so those are the family formation factors. So we have to connect age of marriage to these family formation factors of non-marital childbirth, of single-headed households, of the connection to that. And we see that in the vast majority of cultures, again, the risks and vulnerabilities of those contexts fall primarily, and in some cases almost exclusively, on women. And so those patterns become compounded, making all of the other efforts of sustainable lifestyles and education and economic prosperity all the more challenging in those settings. The other thing I did want to bring to your attention is that we are seeing some new data and some new evidence when it comes to family stability related to age of marriage. This is the trend line that we've seen for a very long time. If you go back to 1995, this is looking at U.S. data here. This is the relationship between the median age of marriage and the likelihood of divorce. Okay? So we see that for a very long time period here, well through those teenage years, up until the early 20s, that as age is added to the age of marriage, the likelihood of divorce decreases dramatically. It's one of the strongest factors that we have. If one or both of the spouses are teenagers at the time of marriage, their likelihood of divorce is greatly increased. But we've also understood that that tends to flatten out with a little bit of benefit over time. But we have had a generational conversation about the risks of teenage marriage. And we've extended that, like I've said, to a bit of an understanding or belief that older is better, and that continues across the life course. Returning to the exact same data set, though, in more current data, this is the trend line we're starting to see with age of marriage and the probability of divorce in the more current cohorts and patterns. It doesn't have a linear trend. It has a curvilinear trend. So again, it continues to reinforce the importance of what I was calling first-order delay. There seems to be some real benefit of that, but we're also starting to note that there might be some unforeseen risks and consequences to second-order delay, as we're actually seeing the stability and the length and the duration of those relationships actually start to rise and increase. This is just a newly identified pattern. We need much more international data to track and see if we see this similar type of pattern, but it's worth noting that we may be creating a bit of a paradox here, something that we believe will increase the likelihood of success, but might actually be having some of those counter effects as well. Why would that be happening? Let me share a few thoughts with you, and then I'll draw to a point of conclusions here as my time gets at its close. I think we see across the globe, and in many cultures in particular, the rise of what I'd call marriage preparation paradoxes. A paradox is a proposition that, despite apparently sound reasoning, leads to a conclusion that is senseless, logically unacceptable, or self-contradictory. Right? So it's the idea of thinking we're going to get something and we're getting the opposite. My best everyday example of that is it's a little bit like turning the jar lid the wrong direction. Right? We're convinced we're loosening the jar lid where we're actually just making it tighter. I think we are moving in some ways in a culture that is promoting marriage preparation paradoxes, that we're promoting patterns that are intended and believed to increase one's chances of marital success and marriage duration, but ultimately are having the opposite effect. Time doesn't allow for too much around this. The cohabitation paradox has long been noted, that we've always had this understanding or idea that this is a good way to prepare for marriage. This is a way to reduce the likelihood of divorce. Studies have shown us now for a generation that couples who cohabit before marriage have higher divorce rates, not lower. And while there might be some evidence that this has weakened recently, no study to date has ever found a protective factor of cohabitation on divorce. Another example of this would be what I'd call the sowing wild oats paradox. We have a general understanding that the young adult and teenage years are a time for us to get it out of our system, particularly when it comes to sexual experimentation and patterns, right? The whole idea is get it out of your system so that then you'll be to a point that you'll be ready to settle down. The evidence is actually pointing that these types of patterns do little to get anything out of people's systems, might actually be doing the quite opposite, getting something into their system. That makes the commitments of monogamy and exclusivity to marriage more difficult, not easier to do. So these become examples of these types of paradoxes. I'll move past this. We see United States data that shows the lifetime sexual partner data shows a culture that's largely embracing this, particularly in the 20-something years. Sexual chemistry patterns that we emphasize is older is better. So basically highlight this idea that we have a number of ways that we're trying to promote marriage readiness, family readiness in the current society, and they may be having paradoxical effects, and that might be what behind those later marriages now starting to have an increased pattern of divorce and less stability, which goes against what we've seen and understood for a very long time. Once again, I just want to emphasize how much this is impacting primarily our lowest income segments of our population. I encourage all of you to spend some time, if you're not familiar with, Ross Shetty's project at Harvard. He's a professor of economics at Harvard. Has the Equal Opportunities Project. So it's a great website, again, with a lot of very good information and data. His data and analysis continues to show that if we're looking to increase upward mobility, we're looking to increase economic situations, particularly for the most disadvantaged, the strongest predictors, he concludes, of upward mobility are measures of family structure. So as has been said, the family is that fundamental unit. It is the root, and the other things ultimately become the fruits that we try to foster. Key factors to promote, and I'll move through this. None of this should be interpreted as saying that we don't keep a broad range of care and compassion for families in all sorts of situations. That's not my message, that's not my view here. I think we have to continue to promote education, health care, and anti-poverty measures for all families. But at the same time, it is worth noting and emphasizing the significant role of the family and of marriage and of family formation patterns, and we can't retreat from that if we are to promote and help families and the rising generation as well. We must be promoting a success sequence of family formation which is promoting the ideal of education before marriage and marriage before childbirth. This will, I believe, require us to include a broader conversation about the relationship consequences of sexuality and cohabitation. It will require us to talk more fully about what I would call sexual agency and decision-making in our lives around how we express sexuality in our lives in ways that are intentional, in ways that are towards building families in the future of lives and those types of things as well. We must increase income security for young adults. The question always comes up, so are you saying that this pattern of delayed marriage is creating the economic outcomes? Don't you think the economic outcomes are creating the delayed pattern of marriage? Yeah, you bet. It's a complex cycle. It's all connected. I don't mean in any way to simplify this, but there's no doubt that the rising generation across many nations is grappling with those realities. We must find ways to help young couples, right, have that type of sustainability. This ties into education and housing, affordable health care, these types of things that will make it where they can prioritize families. If not, they get in a pattern that isn't about promoting their future, they get in a pattern that's only about survival in the immediate context. And so that has to be definitely a part of what we would do to help and sustain. Ultimately, this is about supporting marriage and responsible parenthood. There are limits to what any government can or should do to promote marriage as an institution. Nonetheless, public policy should stop penalizing marriage and should also support initiatives to educate the public about the benefits of marriage and the hazards of single parenthood. This is no different in kind from government efforts to educate the public about the benefits of properly installed car seats for children or the hazards of smoking. Many public policies unintentionally penalize marriage by reducing or eliminating public benefits to parents who marry and thereby have access to two incomes rather than one. Public policies aimed at families should either be offered on a universal basis or should allow the two parents to split their incomes when it comes to determining eligibility for public support. As a final note as I conclude, in the United States we've had the Healthy Marriage Initiative for a number of years now, but it's barely a blip on the screen. It's not getting anywhere near the attention that it could. For example, the National Healthy Marriage Resource Center's The Two of Us campaign, and the twoofus.org website that you could look at, all targeted at helping to promote healthy marriages, the skills needed to do that, emphasizing that as a priority. There's a number of ways that we can put family into the center of these conversations rather than just hoping that it will be the byproduct or the spontaneous pattern that happens. It has to move to the centerpiece of that dialogue and that effort. Thank you.